Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the session. Today's session is Rapidly Securing the Extended Enterprise. And this is in response to what we've been doing for the past few months with what was called unplanned digital transformation. We've been working with Microsoft and with our clients to do backfill the security after the implementations happened. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We thought that it was better just to put a webinar on instead of doing these one-to-one sessions. But I want to say that at the end of the meeting, at the end of the webinar, there is an opportunity to take advantage of some Microsoft money to do some of these sessions together. So if you can make it through the rest of the session, then you'll have that opportunity. So the agenda. So, Teams is the focus of this discussion because Teams has become the new user interface for Microsoft and for collaboration. But to really understand Teams, it's rooted in the Microsoft 365 and Azure platform. So we're going to spend some time talking about the platform briefly, and then we're going to go into Teams architecture and the components that make up the product. And then go into those key configurations for security, compliance, and for external collaboration. Really things that you want to make sure that you're ticking off properly. Then at the end of the discussion, we'll go into Microsoft programs and we'll see what we can do together. So let's start with some quick introductions. My name is Bob Moore. I'm a managing director with Edgile. I have a dual role here. Most of the time I'm doing project work in the Microsoft practice that we have. It's about 65, 70 people, and I work on the Southeast and in the East. But I'm also the co-manager of our Microsoft channel. And my partner today is Drew Wygotsky. Drew's a technical director and author with Edgile. So Drew, you want to give your introduction?
Yeah, good morning and good afternoon. This is Drew Wygotsky. As Bob said, I'm a technical director. What that means is I have responsibility for knowing what's new about Microsoft security and knowing what's coming in Microsoft security across the entire Microsoft landscape with all of our customers and all of our architects and consultants and folks that are out there helping try to secure Microsoft platforms every day.
Awesome. Thank you, Drew. So just a little bit about Edgile. We won't spend a lot of time here, but just to give you the perspective on where we're coming from. So we're a security and compliance organization, and our whole focus, our whole reason for being is to help organizations secure their environment during times of change. And interesting, our mission statement is we secure the modern enterprise, which is a phenomenal mission statement because it never changes. That mission never changes, but the modern enterprise is constantly changing. And right now we find the modern enterprise in a situation of full movement to cloud, still in hybrid, but cloud first strategy of almost with every customer we're dealing with. And so in order to assure a secure and compliant migration, it can't just be you do the cloud technology. It has to be you address the entire organization. We're working with very large, global, highly regulated organizations. So the identity on premises and privileged access needs to be, managed and addressed. Also, integrated risk management can now be automated through tools like ServiceNow and vendor risk management. And all of that can be accelerated to cloud speed. And we're working in that area, but it all supports what we're doing in the transformation to the cloud. We're interested in IaaS and PaaS, but our focus, being a security company, is in Microsoft 365 Modern Workplace. I will say though that Drew is an innovator in what we're doing in DevSecOps, and he's built out some really robust solutions there using application development as a security tool. Very cool. In our focus with Microsoft, just real fast, here's the last one on us. We do We help organizations, if you're starting from top left going to bottom right, we help organizations do the cybersecurity strategy, then understand the solution design. How does it fit into the current environment? What are the risks? So we'll do risk analysis, look at unstructured data, and help to prioritize based on Microsoft best practices and company risk, the level of effort and how projects should be implemented. And then we'll accelerate transformation. This is really interesting. Gone are the days where we're doing big, heavy code development in large identity projects primarily. Now it's about managing the migration to the platform, configuring the platform, not writing code. So we've done it a number of times, and we perfected an accelerated transformation process that has a beginning and an end. And so that's how we actually make it happen. We look at all the user communities, both B2B partners and collaboration, but now B2C is really a very hot area where Microsoft's made it economically attractive and an excellent security platform to migrate millions and millions of external users, customers, to their Azure Active Directory platform. So we're actively involved in that space. And then interesting that after you've done all this work and you've in effect outsourced your technology, your security to the Microsoft platform, how do you stay up on what are the new releases? Should I deploy this? Should I not? Is it something I should do urgently? How does it fit into my strategy? So it creates the opportunity for a new type of managed services. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's very highly expert focused, but it's not as heavy, not as engaged as some of the others. Okay, would you mind going to the next slide, please? Okay, so always like to do polls. We just didn't do a poll here on this one, but what I did poll was our organization and the people who are customer facing in the organization. And we wanted to know some questions about teams, and we got back some answers. So the first question is, how many of the customers rolled out Teams as fast as possible late February when this happened? So many did, and others were already using it, but they had to support this huge uptick. And really the drive was to get it out as quick as possible and get these people productive. And then how many were confident in the security configurations? Well, generally they were. You wouldn't roll it out unless you were relatively confident. But the settings, as we'll see as we go into this discussion a little bit, are complex. They're obfuscated. So although, generally yes, still some questions. And then how many people had user complaints? This was an interesting one. We didn't hear many. There's a little bit of ramp up, and that you have to do with Teams to figure out how it works and how to search things and stuff. But once you get that down, anybody, can do anything. And what we found was, anyone can do just about anything. So that was a challenging notion for security professionals that need to be able to go to sleep at night knowing that these systems are configured properly, that access is being managed properly, guest users and external users are also being managed, and the information is being protected. So anyone can do just about anything? Well, not really everything, but it's enough to be a concern. So the interesting thing about Teams is there's a duality in Teams. It's by design a very open platform. That's the way Microsoft wants it to be because they want to encourage collaboration. But also it can be highly compliant. So it meets 90 different regulatory standards, including HIPAA and GDPR, FedRAMP, SOC, many more. So it's open, yet in the shared responsibility model, the Microsoft parts of it are highly compliant. So the question is, how do they do that? And the answer to the question is, it's built on Microsoft 365. And it leverages the compliance framework that already exists in what was called Office 365. If you haven't gotten the memo, it's now all called Microsoft 365. But it's leveraging SharePoint and all the components of Office 365 that are already built to be compliant. That's quite an advantage to Microsoft's platform over others, but it makes it a little complex because it puts the security controls and configurations in different places. So securing the remote worker requires an understanding of the full Microsoft 365 product suite, from the E3 license, and if you're Microsoft people, you know what I'm talking about, the E3 license to the E5 license. But we're not going to get into all of that. We're going to hit on the key parts that are important. All right, so the foundation, the core of this is securing distributed systems on the internet starts with managing identities of the people and the devices that are involved. And that's what happened with some of the other solutions out there on the market where they don't have the scale or didn't have the identity management. But with Microsoft, over 20 million organizations are in Active Directory now, Azure Active Directory, 20 million. And Microsoft has the economic incentive to ensure that the right users are receiving right access. They've staked their company on it. They've invested billions and billions of their treasure on it, and they make that available in like a fractional model to these 20 million plus organizations. So these are the strengths of Microsoft. Now somebody might say, yeah, but what are the weaknesses? And okay, so there is that Brady bunching issue, but we'll get to that later. Drew, do you want to take it here?
And I need to do it without the mute button. So that'll be our one mistake for today. So let's talk a little bit about the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph. So what Microsoft's been doing kind of quietly over the last decade is taking a lot of work that they've done internally to protect their own properties, whether it's Microsoft.com or the Xbox platform or Windows, and finding ways to bring that data and that information together in a big data real-time analysis kind of world to look at all of the different signals and all of the different information that we have available, not only in our modern enterprise, but also in the world around us. So Microsoft sees about 6.5 trillion threat signals a day. Those are things that could be just a user logging on, known workstation, known account, the user doesn't have any problems, or that could be somebody trying to hack an Xbox or somebody installing a virus onto Windows. And they use that information, over 1 billion different devices that are scanning and sending telemetry, and 630 billion different authentications every month, as well as all the emails and websites and other information that they have available. And they use that and run it through machine learning algorithms to find ways to help you make your enterprise more secure. So that information is increasingly being shared with Microsoft customers, both through the graph itself, so on your own graph, as well as through public information about exploits and vulnerabilities and other challenges that we see. So how does that, affect teams? It's a pretty important thing to start with having a model. So when we look at the model that's pretty common in cybersecurity right now, and really the direction that we'd all like to get as quickly as possible, we like this idea of zero trust. We used to have this hard, firewalled, not dashed line around the enterprise where only the stuff that we trusted was inside the bubble and only the stuff that we didn't trust was outside the bubble. The internet changed that. And then social networking changed it, and then users having apps on their desktop changed it, and then modern authentication and authorization changed it. So that's been a pretty rapidly changing space over the last several years. But the idea is all those new holes that we've opened up in the organization. We want to find ways to build our applications and our platforms in a way that really doesn't assume some level of trust, doesn't assume that that service account should actually be able to read that personal health information or that financial information. We want to take it and break it apart into 3 different zones and really run the kind of defense that's appropriate. So the first is a signal, and that's the part that comes not only off of Microsoft's graph, but off of Microsoft's graph for your tenant. Is that a user that we know? Are they using multi-factor? Is it somebody whose password has been found on the dark web recently? Are they, in 2 impossible locations? Do we actually believe that that user is who we think they are? And then the device risk. Are they on a known device? Have we seen that device before? Is that device registered? Do we have the kind of telemetry that we would from a Windows device or an Intune managed device? And that comes in with all the threat intelligence about what's going on in the world around us that Microsoft can use to make these good decisions. On the right-hand side, we have all the things that need to have policy enforced. So for example, to get back to Teams, we've got documents, and those documents are stored in a lot of places, and we'll talk about some of the places they get stored, and exposed through the Teams interface. Maybe some documents, you can't trust the user unless they're on a network, on a joined workstation, or on a device that we know and we trust, or maybe even that we manage. You want to be able to put those 3 things together, who the person is, what the device is, what the context is, and bring those together in the middle section and have a set of decisions that you can make. So Microsoft calls that set of decisions conditional access. We'll look at it a little bit more in a second, but the idea is that we need to be able to make real-time decisions billions of times per day according to our organization's policy and continually evaluate risk for every new transaction. So whether it's somebody trying to open a document from a box or somebody trying to do authentication to a legacy application on-prem, we want to be able to know when it looks like we might need an extra multi-factor, or we might need the user to change their password. So get them into that remediation box when it's applicable. And if we don't really trust the device, maybe we downgrade the level of information that that user has available. So that all comes together in conditional access. It brings the conditions that we talked about, or that sense data about whether a person is a valid user or an attacker, and a set of controls that allow us to say, do we allow it? Do we block it? Do we require MFA or force a password reset? A really, really important one, and I can't say this enough times, a really, really important one is blocking legacy authentication. If you don't block that legacy off, you don't get the advantage of these controls. There's very few controls that you can do for IMAP, for POP, for SMTP. Secure SMTP is coming out. We're getting a little bit closer to that, but for the most part, those protocols are things that they've already aged out, and this will help you visualize that as you build those policies and get to the point where you've got that real-time evaluation. It's going against your organization's policies, and this is probably the one box where we say if you have the enhanced licenses, you can bring in some extra machine learning and threat information to help make those decisions. So access control and identity is absolutely the key to making Teams secure and really to making the whole Microsoft platform secure. And we'll dive in here in a second and talk about a little bit more about Teams and the architecture and why that's so important. So we've broken today's session into a couple of interesting bits. We've kind of done some introduction to lay some of the business scenario about what we're trying to secure and what kind of things are available to help us get the right people to our teams. Now what we're going to do is kind of take it apart from an architect's point of view and see what the threat landscape looks like and what that model looks like and what it is that we actually have to secure. So in terms of Teams logical architecture, it's one of the most complex offerings that Microsoft has. Like Bob said, it's also one of the fastest growing. And this complexity model that's over on the right-hand side is actually going to continue to get more complex because Microsoft really sees Teams as a platform and something that you can build on, grow on, and that other vendors can build on and grow on. So within every team is a number of other objects on the Microsoft graph, a number of services available that are all tied together through that Teams interface. So we have Office 365 groups and chat services and media services. We have SharePoint Online and Exchange Online, OneNote notebooks, Microsoft Stream like recording like we're doing today, and even the individual users OneDrive for Business. So a lot of that information can be kind of sensitive. And one of the most important takeaways from today is that if you don't do a great job of managing security for Exchange Online, or you don't do a great job of managing your identities in SharePoint Online, it's going to be a really tough road to get to a secure Teams environment, because a lot of times users can work right around that Teams client and they can go directly back to OneDrive or directly back to SharePoint, because these services not only work together, but many of these are existing Microsoft services that work apart as well. It's also important to understand where the data goes. So from a compliance point of view, and there's a whole piece of smart people at Edgile that do the compliance work. I'm not going to purport to be one of them, but it's important to know that the different types of information that are available in Teams, they have their own security and data storage capabilities. And it's important to make sure that those align with the decisions that you're making for Team. So a lot of times when we talk about messages, for example, and those may go through a chat service table and eventually end up in Exchange for compliance, that information is going to be encrypted and managed by Exchange. If we're talking about contact information or voicemails, those again are going to be managed by Exchange. If we're talking about recording video or the audio that goes along, those go through Stream. SharePoint, each one of these layers has its own set of storage and potentially multiple storage behind it. The other thing that's important is that many organizations have data residency requirements. So you may find that you have to keep all of your data in North America, or you need to keep European subject data in Europe. There are switches that are available in Teams to control where data gets stored, as well as in the rest of the O365 platform. So do keep in mind that data residency, but also think about things like archival and the ability to do legal holds. Those are all really important when you're doing Teams, because the more we do in Teams, the more that information is going to be important to the organization. So the next part on this is that there are dependencies, and these are going to be dependencies not just among the technical architecture layers, but these are also going to be dependencies between your teams that are managing Teams. So you may have one group that manages those 365 groups. You may have one group that manages team sites and another that manages OneDrive for Business. It's very important to have those groups in lockstep as you plan and implement your team security, so that you can have the type of defense in depth that's required to make sure that if the user doesn't get in through the Teams client, they can't just go directly to the SharePoint site or go directly to the OneDrive. Again, this is a very identity intensive type of readiness. You need to have good users, you need to have good groups. If you don't have those, then trying to organize this information is going to be pretty tricky. The other thing to know about Teams is that there are different levels that are built out of the box. We've got some new capabilities with groups we'll be talking about in a second. Those default roles put people into 4 different groups. So we have Teams administrators. They're really allowed to do anything. They can manage the team service. They can take permissions that would allow them to do anything in Teams. We have owners. Owners act as moderators for an individual team, so they can add or remove users from a group that's mapped to a team. They have the ability to delete conversations or control who can create new sites. Then there's members. Members can access everything in a group, but they can't change the settings. And most importantly, there's a concept called guests. And we're going to talk quite a bit about guests, so I'm not going to go too deep into that right now. But think of guests as being everybody outside your organization, or potentially everybody that is accessing your teams in an anonymous manner. So Bob, how did we do?
I think you did a good job, Drew. So that's the foundation, the architecture of the platform, and now we're going to talk about operations. An interesting thing, Drew, is that in this platform, there's a lot of stakeholders involved here. So you have the security, the CISO organization that's worried about the security of the platform. You have a compliance organization because you're doing collaboration and you have to make sure you're keeping your walls up and you're maintaining compliance. And then you might even have line of business that wants to use Teams for external collaboration with their clients. So why don't we dive into these a little bit more from an operational perspective? So from the CISO world, Drew, then what what are the things that need to be configured to ensure that the platform is secure?
So there are a few key things that we want to be concerned about. We want to be concerned about data and how data is encrypted. We definitely want to consider multi-factor and when it's appropriate to make sure that a user has an additional authentication factor. We need to look a little bit about monitoring, attachments, links. These are all very much like email, in fact, integrated with Exchange, where you want to consider some of the risks and some of the threat landscape and turn on the appropriate policies, both in terms of the way that you configure Teams, as well as the way that you configure the rest of Azure, for example, your conditional access. So let me pop over here to my home page. Can you see my home page?
Looks good, Drew.
All right, so the first thing that you'll notice is that on your Office 365 homepage, you need to figure out how to get to Teams settings. So if you're an administrator, you'll be able to go to Admin and then Show All, and there'll be a link down here in the Admin Center to Teams. And most of what we're going to look at today is going to be in that Teams Administration Center. So there's a few things that you want to be concerned about. The first you want to be concerned about is, are you getting the right identity information? So am I getting the right teams and the right groups coming in from my Office 365 groups? And if you've already been using Teams, which most of you probably already have, making sure that the type of privacy that's appropriate for each of the teams is the one that's configured. You can go a lot deeper here. I'm not going to go totally into identity, but I can tell you that if there's one thing that is a prerequisite, it's making sure that at least you know where your identities are and that they're going to map up well with the things that you need to protect in Teams. The next layer we have is a number of policies, and we'll talk about messaging policies and we'll talk about meeting policies that allow us to set some organization-wide defaults. Before you turn those on, chances are you need to go to actual organization-wide settings. We'll come back and look at those in a second, though. The policy, for example, I've got a restricted access policy, and these are the users that the only thing they can really do is chat and send messages to each other. So I've turned off the ability for those users to send messages or edit messages or use memes or use Giphies. And that's a really important one, particularly when you're dealing with outside users, because we already know about some challenges with Giphies and the potential for getting in through the side door. So this set of rules is considered the overall messaging policies. These are the ones that apply to everything a user does. There are some more specific ones, which we'll get into in a second. So those are some of the key components. We'll talk more about encryption, but I think that'll give you a good start for what some of the built-in security features are.
Well, how about from a compliance perspective, Drew? What kind of controls exist that enable compliance organizations to be able to audit properly?
Yeah. So these controls start getting down into the individual channels and the individual chats. So the first thing to know is that you may need some barriers. So for example, if you have a part of your organization that's working on a joint venture, and maybe it's something that's a super secret project, you may want to put a barrier around that group so that those groups can communicate with each other, but other groups can't see their information. This may be information that they post as files. This could be group chats, team level chats, meeting notifications. So do know where your barriers are and where you need to protect information. The second part is around communication compliance, making sure that sensitive information that you need to keep over time, things where you have an internal or a regulatory requirement for that, or maybe you just want to make sure that in that space where you bring in your vendors and partners, you're being really careful about offensive language. And the last one being retention policies. So we'll look at a couple of the different policies here. Again, some of these policies are in Teams, some of these are in SharePoint, some of these are in Exchange. It's really important to consider that defense in depth as you build your strategy. So for meeting policies, I have the ability to, again, set some lockdowns. These lockdowns get more specific to my particular set of meetings or my particular set of channels. So for example, do we have a Meet Now button? Do we allow a meeting to be scheduled for a particular channel? Is audio and video turned on? Is content sharing available? And if so, we can sharing content, but maybe we don't give the ability for an external participant to take that over because we've got requirements from a compliance point of view that would limit our ability to do that. Participants and guests are pretty important. You want to consider which parts of your organization may have some sensitivity about starting a meeting. So there's different types of meetings. There's a meeting like I have inside my organization that has the boxes. There can also be like this meeting, a live meeting where a couple of presenters are presenting to a very large group of audience. So what we want to make sure is that we consider the right matchup between these policies and the parts of our organization and the different security and audit and compliance requirements that are appropriate for that group. So there's settings for meeting policies, settings for individual meetings, so whether or not a person can join as an anonymous person. There are policies around live events, and for example, if you want to say nobody else can start recording the live event except for the host of the event, we can set permissions that will control that and then tie that information back to the individual people in the organization.
We talked about guests, Drew, and guest access. So how do you make information available to these guests, and how do you audit or recertify?
Yeah. So the first thing to know about guests is that guest is a feature not just of Teams, but guest is really it's a feature of Office 365. So if you start at your admin portal for Office 365, you're going to see a Teams box here, and it's going to tell you whether or not guest access is on. So that first button, this is one of the ones that takes the longest. It gives you a warning that when you click it to turn on guest access in Teams, that it could take a couple of hours for those capabilities to turn on. The rest of them are pretty fast. Most of them are within a few minutes, and a few of them could take up to an hour, but this is the one that you need to plan ahead for. You also want to plan ahead for it from a security point of view and a compliance point of view and a support and operations point of view, because once you turn that on, your users are going to have a lot of ability to start inviting people in, and when you invite them in, you could unintentionally invite them into a SharePoint site that has sensitive information. So do plan before you turn that box on. If you've already turned that box on, that's probably a good time to get a pretty serious audit of your Teams, Exchange, and SharePoint settings, as well as your Azure Conditional Access settings, so that you know what access is actually allowed to those guests. The next set of settings comes down here in the organization-wide settings in Teams. So in my tenant here, I've locked Teams down from a federation point of view, and I've said anybody that I am going to trust for federation by Teams. That means they can contact my users by chat, or they can get accounts that allow them to temporarily have access to a SharePoint site. I want them all to be on this white list. By default, this list is not populated, and this button is on, so that means that external users can communicate with your organization. So one of the first things to do is to consider whether or not you need to lock that down, which chances are you need to, and then how are you going to manage that list of the organizations that you've federated with. The next organization-wide setting is guest access, and this is where we can say globally across our entire tenant, what are the things that guests are able to be given permission to do. So it doesn't necessarily say they have the permission, it only says that we've got rules that would allow guests to do these things. So for example, do we allow guest access at all? If I hit that button and turn that off, guests are very quickly not going to be able to access my teams across any team, regardless of what the individual meeting or channel settings are. Whether or not calling is available, meetings and video, whether or not messaging is available. This is one I would normally say turn off those Giphies. At least for guest users, it's probably not all that valuable. Memes and stickers, again, unless you have a really important need on those, it's probably best to turn those off. The immersive reader is pretty helpful, so I think I've got a pretty good start for the organization. Again, you want to make sure that these align with your individual compliance requirements, audit policies, regulatory compliance requirements, because depending on your shape as an organization, some of this information, once you start allowing it, becomes information that you have to audit, and so you want to be careful about that. Tie it back to your compliance and retention settings in SharePoint and Exchange and in OneDrive, so that you've got the right kind of protections in place. So the other part that Bob was asking about is in the Azure portal itself. So in my Azure portal, I can go into Azure Active Directory, which for some reason is not at the top of my screen, and I can manage what are called external identities. So external identities are different sign-in users that are not part of your home domain. So if your home domain is edgile.com, this is going to be everybody that's outside of edgile.com. And we can do permissions that allow us to manage those users and allow us to bring in guests, send them invites so they can start collaborating with your organization, keep track of email addresses. And again, the reason why it's so important to start moving toward guests is that, quite frankly, you don't know whether that person is still with that organization. So if you've got a vendor relationship and you've got a number of contractors that are on site working on your systems, how long is it before you know that they've left that vendor and you need to turn them off? By getting to Modern Auth and by getting to these kind of guest invites, we allow our vendors and partners and other organizations we work with to have more control over what users can be associated with their organization, but hopefully they do a pretty good job of identity management so that you can tell when they've been turned off. And I can, as Bob said, I can get in there and I can audit those and I can find out who's been using externally, and I can even get reports on guest access up here in my Teams dashboard, and find out who's been using what and what we need to turn on or turn off. The other piece to talk about, we're going to talk a little bit here as we get in the advanced session about guest access and some of the different things that you can start to do with roles and with governance. So a really important note, Teams is not just chat. Teams is not just chat and audio. Teams is not just chat and audio and video. And it's not just chat and audio and video and files and OneDrives and SharePoint sites. Teams is a platform, and Microsoft is putting a whole bunch of emphasis in making this platform available to developers, both within your organization and outside your organization, as a way to build new interactive apps. Imagine, for example, a channel that you can go to say, I have a problem with my computer, can you help me? And in the context of that chat, you get information from bots and from support personnel, and all that information comes together and allows you to do cool things. Well, if we just go back 1 week, Microsoft made some really big announcements at Build 2020 about all the different features that are available for Teams. The first thing that you'll notice about that is almost all of those are about apps. And the second thing that you'll notice about it is the next big group is mobile. So the vision and really what Microsoft's executing on here is making those available. There's other things about the way that it works with Azure Active Directory, some additional conditional access capabilities, some tie-ins with Visual Studio Code so that you can publish apps directly within your organization. All of these are things that you need to be aware of. And really the message for this is that Microsoft will continue to change Teams. They will continue to evolve Teams. They will continue to put new capabilities on top of Teams. So this journey to Teams security, it's not a one-time event. It's something that you really need to have an operational strategy for how you'll maintain Teams over time. So let's look at a few of the advanced topics. So our sessions today, they're not going to be able to go into all the depth of how you configure Teams. There's a lot to Teams, there's a lot to Azure, there's a lot to all the different pieces that go into it. What we wanted to do is put a few first steps for you so that you can have some really great baseline to start from, and then work to grow it from there. So one of the first ones is understand your encryption requirements. Depending on your organization, depending on where you are organized, depending on where you have employees, depending on where you have customers, and depending on what kind of, whether you're a FISMA and you've got financial requirements, or a HIPAA and you've got healthcare information, a lot of those speak to what type of encryption are important. So knowing where encryption applies is probably a good chunk of the battle here. So things that are stored in SharePoint, like the files in our Teams channels, they're backed by SharePoint encryption. There's some SharePoint encryption that is just transparent on the back end that protects it when it gets saved. There's also the ability to put information protection policies on top of it so that you can use keys and public key to protect your information. Notes are stored in OneNote. They have OneNote encryption. Really important note on this one: if you forget your password, nobody's going to be able to unlock it. And they use some pretty advanced use of algorithms to very, very difficult to reverse engineer that. As far as I know, no hacks on that yet. Stay tuned, I'm sure they'll come. The OneNote data is stored in a team SharePoint site, so there's AES involved in that. And this is just looking at the information that's stored in SharePoint and OneDrive. There's additional information stored in Exchange. There may be information stored in apps. All of those can use encryption. It's important to have a good threat model and to understand what data is encrypted and when is it encrypted and when does it become decrypted. Guest users are something that I mentioned earlier. So a guest user is a user that's in my Active Directory, but they come from what we call a partner tenant. So my home tenant, if I'm at Edgile and I'm Josh, I'll log in and get information about my user, and it's going to say I'm Josh Toon at edgile.com. If I go to any one of our customers that are federating with us or creating guest users with us, it'll still say my mail is joshua.toon@edgile.com, but it'll give me a different user principal name. It's something that tells Microsoft, yes, this is Josh Toon at Edgile, but he's being authorized to access information at Suite So Soft. What this allows us again to do is to have the kind of requirements on our users that are shared between us and our partners. So that way the first line of defense for Josh has left the building is that when we terminate one of our employees or when one of our employees wins the lottery, we're going to turn off that account. And the next time he tries to present it to your Office 365 tenant, he's not going to be able to get to the point where he could present a token and then be subject to your authentication and your authorization requirements. It also gives us some new tools to look at, what access do they have? What roles have they been given in our Azure tenant? So I can see his account from Microsoft, his account from Edgile, and his account from Gmail. It's important to know that there are three main classes here. There's the B2E, which are the employees, the people in your Active Directory. There's the B2B, which are the business relationships that you have or organizational relationships. And as Bob referred to earlier, there's the B2C, which is all those users that are coming from Outlook and Gmail that are becoming an increasingly important part of our collaboration strategies. Conditional access is something that I can't say enough about. I talked about it at the beginning, and I'm going to talk about it again now. The idea behind conditional access is we don't want to assume that just because that document is stored on that file server that it's safe. We want to be able to put an envelope on it, encrypt that document, store it up in SharePoint, make it available through Teams, and when the user tries to access that document and it's got super secret information about our organization or our business strategies or people's personal finance and health information, that we have the ability to take signals and to take that data and protect it and verify access at every access attempt, but do it in a way that allows us to be flexible as an organization in terms of who we share information with and how that information is shared. So there's a lot of different approaches to this one. The key is make sure you know how you validate who your users are, manage good identity, have some strategy for your devices so that we can see that a device is healthy, and build the appropriate, we used to call them least privilege rules that make sure that the right user on the right device has access, and the right user may be on the wrong device, or maybe their password got hacked yesterday and it's out on the dark web already. We have the ability to take and lock them down a bit, help them remediate, and get back to the point of being able to verify every access attempt. So one piece of that, I'll go back for 1 second. One piece of that, the idea of device real-time risk. So some of the features are available right out of the box with E3. Some of the features are available with additional licensing through Microsoft 365 E5. Some of these pieces are available in both. So it's really important to have a good map to understand the pieces that your organization's licensed for. Again, identity is critical to this because we want to be able to have the right kind of protections for a user's use cases. It may not make sense to have all the advanced threat protection for a cloud user, the Defender on-prem threat protection, but it absolutely would make sense to have the cloud app security. So it's important to work with your Microsoft team and with organizations like Edgile to understand what you're capable of, and then do pay attention to how those things are configured, because those can affect your results when doing things like Teams. In a perfect world, if you have something happen and detected in a threat protection scenario, we want to be able to get that to people that can determine, hey, we've got a problem, and lock your account down so that you can't get access to the wrong information, or have the system lock you down. So there's a lot more that you can do in terms of analytics, artificial intelligence, things like detonation, additional things around identity protection. Each level provides you a set of capability, and what you want to make sure is that your set of capabilities are aligned with your security policies and with your regulatory conditions. The next big thing for Microsoft is taking identity that's been done traditionally on premise and starting to transition into the cloud and bring that information entirely into the cloud. So two big things that are going on. The first was privileged identity management. What that means is that we don't want to give our administrators the ability to go and delete all the groups anytime they want. What we want is for them to check that permission out, have it for a particular purpose, maybe have some approvals or some multi-factors that are associated, and then take that permission away as soon as they're done doing the thing that required them to be a SharePoint admin or required them to be a Teams admin. That's a really great capability. It's very hard to implement unless you have something like identity governance, which allows you to look over time and say, hey, does that person still need the ability to check out a global administrator? Or are they done with the role that requires them to do that, so that you can do things like attestation campaigns and access reviews. Not going to go into this one, we're getting a little bit close today, but the vision on this is really that all the different things that you need access to from Microsoft, whether it's a piece of Teams or SAP HANA or some finance app or maybe a box out in the cloud, is all going to be able to run through this identity governance entitlement management, so that when you have a complex application that requires some permissions in Teams and permissions in SharePoint and permissions in OneDrive and permissions on the Microsoft Graph, that all of those can be treated together so that you can check out what you need to be a marketing level 1 person. This is an E5 capability. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob and thank you all, and stick around and see what kind of questions you have.
That was tremendous, Drew. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.
So it's there's a lot to cover. It's a broad and deep platform, but it delivers it right to Teams, and you get access to the entire platform just by using the productivity suites. So what we covered today was the architecture, which is derived from the Microsoft 365 platform. We talked about the key focus areas for security, compliance, and for external users. We went into some of the advanced features and talked a little bit about the roadmap and the continual flow of new capabilities that's being rolled out. So you would think that we're finished, right? So how do we get started? But that's not really true, because we did have that one question out there about Brady bunching. So I hope that you've seen the depth of the platform and the security and identity and device management capabilities that really secure this platform. I don't know if you have it yet, but we got it rolled out recently, the 3x3 matrix in Teams. So it looks pretty good, and they create different mosaics with it. And also you can use Teams Live in Teams Live events like we're using today. So the combination of the security capabilities plus the usability, we think, really wins the day. So getting started, I mentioned early on that Microsoft has put programs out there, and these aren't programs that you have to go talk to your Microsoft rep about. These are programs that we're able, because of our status, we're able to go and request funding for this from Microsoft directly. We keep your reps informed, but there's three kinds of programs to get started. And the first is a partner accelerator, they call it. They at times will come out with specific topics, but when COVID came out, they just issued a secure the external worker partner accelerator. It's a 3 or 4 2-hour workshop session where we go deep into what we've discussed today and into other areas as you'd like. And that's running right through. We can request for that through June 30th, as long as it gets delivered within 90 days. So that's still available. The partner investment engine, after you've done the analysis, now you want to do a POC or explore it a little bit more. They have another program called Partner Investment Engine that pays for 5 to 8 days sometimes to do a POC and do the architecture and design of what the implementation will look like. And then for self-service, for you self-service organizations that say, I don't need you guys, I don't need Edgile. If you remember Fast Track, Office 365 Fast Track, it was very effective, and it was just an internal Microsoft group that would help move things along and help you adopt Office 365. Well, they have the same thing now for the security capabilities, but it's a little more complex. So they've enlisted a few partners, and we're one of them. So we're able to deliver this fast track benefit at no cost to you, and none of these programs are at a cost to the client. And then we can help you, adopt the platform. So all of this is just the partner accelerators available right now, and fast track. They'll be resetting as July, as the new year starts. So let's get engaged. We're eager to work with you. We're not asking for very large contracts to be able to come in and talk to you and help to move this along. All we need for the partner accelerator is your company name, a company email address, and your Microsoft tenant ID. Then we'll go make the request. We'll work with you to structure what you want to address. And then you'll be talking to people like Drew and others in the organization that really understand this platform. The other thing is we've rolled out a Microsoft advisory program, and if you're familiar at all with digital partner of record, it's taking a partner and attaching that partner to your Azure subscription. A lot of times you just attach them to the subscription, you never hear from the partner. We're not like that. You make the commitment to us to attach us to your subscription, then we'll create a relationship with you. So it'll open benefits to new programs like the ones we just talked about today, but there's others and that we get because of our status. Give you preferred access to guys like Drew and the others on the team. Also access to the Microsoft product groups in Redmond. A lot of times you're talking to the field teams, great people, but your questions are better answered by Redmond, and that's where we interface. We deliver a customized Microsoft roadmap. So you saw all the features that Drew put on that one slide. How do you make sense of all that? Well, that's what we'll do for you on a quarterly basis. So look in your tenant, and if you notice a partner ID there that you haven't heard from at all, try us. We'll create a nice relationship together. All right, last slide, 1 minute, last slide. So we want to say thank you. We really did appreciate your time and your focus today. We have a number of webinars coming up. ServiceNow for business continuity is coming up next week. CyberArk, which is kind of a dovetail with the privileged identity management we talked about. So this is real, tracking and doing video and keystroke tracking of privileged access management with our partner CyberArk. F5 and Microsoft, this is going to be a really interesting one. It's those legacy applications you've got no business case for moving to the cloud. F5 and Microsoft, along with us, can modernize that and use this modern authentication. And SailPoint and ServiceNow, that's another one. Don't have time to go into it, but it's going to be a really good one. If you're a ServiceNow customer, if you have SailPoint, it integrates SailPoint into the ServiceNow ITSM. So for questions or to contact us, we're really eager to talk to you. Our email is info@edgile.com. And we want to thank you very much for your time today. And with that, we'll end the webinar.